In the previous clip, we changed the app component into a pure component, but that did not help us because the app component is still wastefully re-rendering 5 times in our measurement period. So to optimize the performance of the app component, we need to carefully analyze what is going on. And that means looking at the render method of the app component and what that render method is using. And by carefully looking at the render method of the app component, we know that it's using the articles object and also the search term from the state. But the app component initializes its state as the full state of the store. And then for every change in the store, it locally sets the complete state of the store as its own state. But here's the thing, the app component doesn't really need the full store state. It only needs the articles and the search term out of the state. So the fact that we have more properties on the state that changes makes the app component re-render wastefully. Now, there are a few solutions to this problem. The simplest solution is to customize the should component update operation of the app component. And basically, we can have a condition here to return true only if the next state dot articles does not equal the current state dot articles, or when the next state dot search term does not equal the current state dot search term. And that actually should solve our problem. Let's test. Re-render, and the app is working fine, the search is working, and we don't have the app component as a wasteful render. The timestamp actually just ticked, so everything is working, but we don't have the app component as a wasteful render. And all of what we needed to do is to customize the should component update and only actually re-render if we have a reason to. However, while this solution works, it's not really the best solution because this means that there is a dependency between the render component and the should component update. So every time we want to use a new property on the state inside the render function, that means that we need to change the should component update logic to include that thing. So we could actually do better than that. There is another solution to this problem. Instead of subscribing to the whole state, we can just subscribe to a portion of the state. So we can, for example, have a function here. Let's name it app state. And this function reads the store state. So instead of reading the whole state in here, we can just read the articles and the search term out of the store state. So destructure articles and search term out of the store state, and then return those articles and search term. Just like that, because this is the exact state that we want out of the store. And now, instead of reading the state of the store directly, we can always read this .app state in here and also in here as well. And if we do that, the state of the app component only changes when either the articles or the search term changes. So let's go ahead and test that. The app is rendering, I still search, things are working, we'll verify that the time is ticking, and I do not have the app component as a wasteful render. So the application is working exactly the same, but now the app component only subscribes to a partial state of the store. And also the timestamp is still ticking. Now you might ask, how is the timestamp is still ticking when the app component is not really aware of the timestamp state? And the reason is the timestamp component reads the timestamp state out of the store directly. It doesn't need the app component to read that. So we made the app component independent of that timestamp change, and now the app component only re-renders when either the articles object or the search term changes. And that's a much better way. In fact, we should always do that. We should always make a connected component subscribe to the part of the state that it's interested in, not the whole state, because subscribing to the whole state will cause us to do wasteful re-renders. This also applies to the remaining cases of the wasteful re-renders, which are all the container component. Because the container components right now just force update themselves when the state of the store changes, but really they don't need to. They only need to force update if the state of the component that they contain is changing. And we can actually do this optimization really easily. So let's take a look at contained component. The article component is contained. It depends on the author. So it doesn't really depend on the state at all. The search bar component doesn't depend on any extra state as well. The timestamp component does depend on an extra state. So the timestamp component needs to force update when the timestamp property on the state changes, but nothing else, only when the timestamp property of that state changes. So the extra props function here is key. If we're returning from extra props a property that depends on the store state, then we force update the component if that property changes on the state. So we can generically do that in the store provider function. Let's try to do that. Instead of force update, let's think about doing a set state call, but only for the part of the state that is actually relevant. So let's call this part this.used state, and I'll make that into a function. So this used state function would be only the properties from the state that are being used by the wrapped component, and we can compute these properties from the extra props function. So we have two cases here. Sometimes we return an extra prop that uses the state, and sometimes we return an extra prop that doesn't really use the state. To simplify the logic of what we need to do next, let's just assume that everything in the extra props is a used state. So the used state is actually the extra props call itself. So I'm going to create a used state function and just return the extra props function invoked with the context store and this.props, and I'll go ahead and use it here as well. So this.used state. And now the container component only sets the state that's being used by the wrapped component. And I think that is going to get rid of some of these wasteful re-renders. Let's test. So the app is rendering correctly, but I still see the article container, the search bar container, and the timestamp container. So let's go ahead and dig deeper. I'm going to kill this force update. And to figure out why these container components are still re-rendering, we need to do an inspection inside component will update. And in here, we can just simply console log this.state and the next state, just to see what's going on in here. Let's go ahead and test that. So we have a few cases here. Let's first focus on the search bar container, which is being wastefully re-rendered once. And here is the call here. So it started with a null state, and the next state had an empty object. So we can easily fix that. So this is actually happening because I don't initialize a state. So let's go ahead and initialize the state, which is exactly the same. State equal this.used state. That actually should fix the search bar component because now it will always be an object. So let's test that. However, I'm getting this.used state is not a function. And that's actually because we need to put this used state before this operation. Let's make sure things are working now. And they are. And now let's take a look at the wasteful renders. And the wasteful renders is now only the timestamp component. So by making the higher order wrapped component subscribes to only the part of the state that is being used, we fixed the wasteful renders of both the search bar component and the article component. And now the only wasteful renders is happening in the timestamp component. So why is the timestamp component being wastefully re-rendered every second? Well, because we have the logic of time display in here inside the timestamp component itself. So the timestamp container is still ticking every second and it's still changing the timestamp value, and the display portion, the timestamp component, is only re-rendering every minute. So we can fix this problem by moving this logic to the timestamp container component. So instead of using a should component update here, and instead of rendering this time display timestamp in here, we can do something like this.props.timestamp display and call the time display function in here. So this.time display is what we're interested in. However, I don't have access to the component instance inside the extra props, but here's the thing, I don't need access to the component instance because this time display function doesn't really depend on the component instance. So I can actually make it into a static function. And instead of calling it with this.timeDisplay, I call it with timestamp, the component itself, .timeDisplay. So let's test that. Now the application is re-rendering, but I don't see the timestamp display at all. So let's fix that. So the property here is timestamp display. All right, let's test. I see the timestamp and it's not being wastefully re-rendered. In fact, the wasted table operation is empty. You see that? We don't have any more wasteful operations. And the timestamp component is still working. Every minute, the time is going to change, and the timestamp display is going to change, and the timestamp container is going to re-render correctly. When it does, it's not really being wastefully re-rendered because it's re-rendering different content to the DOM. So now we can remove this component will update lifecycle method because we just used it to figure out why the component is being re-rendered. So let's do one final test. Make sure the search is working, and it is. Make sure the timestamp component is re-rendering, and it is. So at this point, if we don't want to do any more performance optimization analysis, we can practically remove the perf code. So both the set immediate and set timeout calls can go away in here. So this analysis of why the component updated is very important. In fact, there's a package that you can actually use to see why components are updating unnecessarily. And it gives you exactly the values before and after and tells you if an unnecessary re-render is avoidable. So if you don't want to do what we did manually, you can also use that package to give you some clues of why some components are re-rendering unnecessarily.